Hey, it's Lou, and some wild shit is going down in Venezuela, where two men claim to be president. The head of the National Assembly, Juan Guaido, laid claim to the office on January 23rd. He's a former student activist and a relative unknown, but he's boldly challenging the legitimacy of Nicolas Maduro, the socialist strongman who's been Venezuela's head of state since 2013. Maduro's regime has been characterized by corruption, incompetence, brutality, sham elections, and authoritarianism. He's wrecked the economy. GDP has been cut nearly in half since he's taken office. Inflation is estimated to reach 10 million% by the end of the year, which basically means the currency is worthless. Although, it's not like there's a ton to buy. There are severe shortages of food and medicine. In 2017, the average Venezuelan lost 24 pounds. The malnutrition is grimly nicknamed the Maduro diet. Meanwhile, Maduro has repeatedly refused humanitarian help, declaring Venezuela is not a country of beggars. In addition, 3 million people have fled the country, sparking a refugee crisis in Latin America. And 80% of Venezuelans want Maduro out of office. But he refuses to go, defying calls from protesters, regional neighbors, and an increasingly aggressive United States. So, how the hell did things get so bad in oil-rich Venezuela? And can the opposition put an end to the crisis? In order to understand Nicolas Maduro and how he's transformed Venezuela into a failed state, you have to understand his predecessor, Hugo Chavez. After all, Maduro has referred to himself as the son of Chavez. Chavez, a military officer, launched a coup attempt against the Venezuela government in 1992. The coup failed, but Chavez, a charismatic speaker, connected with a marginalized segment of the population. In other words, a star was born. And keep in mind, dissatisfaction with the entrenched political parties and their self-dealing elites was extremely high. Between 1972 and 1997, as much as $100 billion was embezzled from the country's substantial oil operation. Juxtapose that with the fact that the majority of the country lived in poverty by the end of the 1990s, and you'll get a sense that the government wasn't really working for the people. So Chavez, who was jailed, then pardoned following that coup attempt, ran for president in 1998 on a socialist platform. He pledged to use the country's oil billions to reduce poverty and inequality. He won the election, and a lot of the top-line statistics during his 14 years as president point to success. Income per capita increased, the GDP grew, the poverty rate was cut by more than half, unemployment nosedived, education improved, and infant mortality rates declined. For a lot of left-leaning folks the world over, here was evidence that socialism worked. Chavez got bonus points among some progressives because he was a vocal antagonist to George W. Bush following the U.S. invasion of Iraq.
Chavez took direct aim at President Bush, calling him a devil.
Yesterday, the devil came here. And it smells of sulfur still today.
Yet, it wasn't like Chavez was a model leader. He had a severe authoritarian streak that went into overdrive after he survived a 2002 coup attempt that reportedly had the blessing of the U.S. Chavez ended term limits, stuffed the Supreme Court with cronies, antagonized the press, shut down independent media outlets, and eroded checks and balances by filling democratic institutions with yes men. In addition, Venezuela's new prosperity and the government's generous spending on social programs was not sustainable. Javier Corrales, a professor of Latin American studies at Amherst College, told me Chavez was one of the luckiest leaders in world history because the price of oil was sky high during his tenure. Corrales told me that Chavez got drunk on easy oil money and showed neither fiscal restraint nor the ability to save for a rainy day. Consider, by the end of 2013, the year Chavez died in office, Venezuela's international money reserves totaled $22 billion, enough to pay for just 5 months of imports. On the other hand, Saudi Arabia, another petrostate that imports a lot of basic necessities, had accumulated $725 billion in reserves by that time, enough to cover 5 years of imports. Corrales added that Chavez established an excessive number of price controls, laws designed to limit what a company can charge for certain products. Businesses were now making less money, if at all, and many made the decision to cease production altogether. Furthermore, Chavez expropriated many businesses. What was once a private operation became a state-controlled operation. Problem is, a lot of the government bureaucrats put in charge of these recently expropriated businesses lacked the appropriate expertise. Often, their only qualification was their relationship to Chavez. When oil workers went on strike calling attention to this type of gross mismanagement, Chavez fired almost half of them. Losing all these trained specialists hurt oil production, the lifeblood of the economy. On top of all this, corruption within the Chavez regime was prevalent, and a perverse money exchange program that gave preferential exchange rates to the well-connected exacerbated inequality. Basically, Chavez's cronies got a discount on foreign currency, which allowed them to buy products on the cheap and sell them on the black market. This was a system that exploited the poor. So, while the economy gave the illusion of humming along, there were fissures underneath the surface. And then, in 2013, Chavez went to Cuba for cancer treatment. Before he died, he urged Venezuelans to choose his VP, Nicolas Maduro, as his successor. Maduro was voted into office later that year. Unfortunately for him, he inherited Chavez's mess and his debts. In 2014, a tumble in oil prices sent Venezuela into an economic freefall, ushering a new era of poverty and desperation. Hunger swept across the country. There were severe shortages of not just food and medicine, but also water and electricity. A doctor described the country's hospitals as something from the 19th century.
No había comido y me sentía tan mareada y me desmayé.
Moises Rendon, an associate director at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, told me Maduro accelerated Chavez's authoritarianism. He's banned protest, arrested rivals, killed dissidents, rigged elections, disempowered the National Assembly, and exploited the desperation of the marginalized. For instance, Rendon told me that the government hands out food boxes, and in order to get one, you have to show a certain high-tech identification card. A ton of personal information is stored on this card, and if you've been arrested for attending a protest or there's evidence of some other anti-Maduro activity, you won't get the box. Rendon added that that's why Maduro has rejected humanitarian aid over and over. If there was another source of sustenance, this form of weaponized hunger wouldn't work. And by the way, these boxes often contain unsafe products. The fact that they're still widely coveted is yet another piece of evidence demonstrating the horrifying misery in a country that ought to be affluent. I mean, Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world. On top of all this, Maduro is also running a mafia state. His inner circle has been credibly implicated in all types of crimes, including drug trafficking. He uses hired thugs, dubbed colectivos, to stamp out dissent and intimidate journalists and rivals. Meanwhile, his allies, so-called plugged-in people, or enchufados, reap special benefits from a patronage system as long as they stay loyal to the regime. Now, with this type of track record, you think Maduro would be voted out of office, but in May 2018, he won re-election, although two of his main rivals were barred from running and most of the opposition boycotted the process because they thought it was rigged. Therefore, more than 50 countries rejected the results. Not that Maduro really cared. Enter into this scene 35-year-old Juan Guaido. Guaido, a newcomer to the world of government, was elected as the head of the National Assembly on January 5th, 2019. A few days later, Maduro was sworn into his second full term in office as a result of that fraudulent May 2018 election. But Venezuela's National Assembly, which has been stripped of power but is generally considered the last democratic institution in Venezuela, refused to recognize the legitimacy of that second Maduro term. Ditto with many foreign governments. So on January 23rd, Guaido declared that he was the rightful president of the country. The date was symbolic. It was the 61st anniversary of the overthrow of Venezuela's previous dictatorship. Tens of thousands of demonstrators across the country took to the streets to show support to Guaido. The US and most of Venezuela's Latin American neighbors immediately recognized Guaido as the head of Venezuela's government, suggesting there might have been some coordination in advance. Alan Brewer-Carias, a lawyer and professor emeritus at the Central University of Venezuela, told me that Guaido didn't just seize power. Rather, the Venezuelan constitution required him to claim the presidency. He had an obligation because a section of the constitution states that in the absence of a legit president or vice president, the leader of the National Assembly must assume the role of head of state on an interim basis. Maduro, unsurprisingly, refused to step aside. He's dismissed Guaido as a little boy. Meanwhile, Maduro's foreign allies, like Russia and China, maintain he's the country's true leader. So, with two men claiming to be president, each backed by foreign powers, how does this end? Well, it probably comes down to Venezuela's military. Writing in the New York Times opinion section, Guaido himself asserts, quote, "The military's withdrawal of support for Mr. Maduro is crucial to enabling a change in government." But the thing is, Maduro has successfully co-opted the military's leadership. Miguel Tinker Salas, professor of Latin American Studies at Pomona College, told me Maduro has incorporated them into his regime and linked their prosperity to his staying power. For instance, Maduro has allowed military brass to control dozens of industries, things as diverse as rubber and insurance. Furthermore, he's promoted many of them. There are 2,000 generals in Venezuela, a comically high number. Plus, Maduro has extremely close relationships with Cuba's intelligence operations. They give him daily briefings and keep an eye out for potential turncoats in the armed forces, so paranoia might prevent a military coup in Venezuela. But discontent may be growing in the lower ranks of the military. Many of them are paid the equivalent of just $15 a month, which won't even feed a family of 4 for 2 days. No surprise then that in January of this year, 27 National Guardsmen stole weapons and declared themselves in rebellion. The uprising was quickly put down, but clearly the military might go in either direction. Guaido and the National Assembly have promised amnesty for soldiers that are willing to help build democracy. The opposition has even suggested that Maduro could retire peacefully in a place like Cuba if he were to step aside. In other words, he wouldn't be prosecuted for his many crimes. Salas warned me that a fracture in the military might lead to a civil war. He's also wary that a military coup against Maduro might eventually boomerang and hurt Guaido. Salas explained that the opposition in Venezuela is very fractured. They don't really trust each other, and not everyone is wholeheartedly behind the young upstart. They're currently unified in their hatred of Maduro, but once he's gone, things could quickly fall apart and turn violent. And keep in mind, some of the opposition represent the old pre-Chavez way of doing things that was so unpopular in the country, that paved the way for this disastrous implementation of socialism. Salas added that the Trump administration is so involved in the situation because it's an opportunity to underscore the failures of socialism as politicians like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez popularize the ideology in the states.
America will never be a socialist country.
National Security Advisor John Bolton, meanwhile, accidentally showed the press a notepad with 5,000 troops to Colombia scrawled across it, suggesting the Trump administration is preparing a military intervention. They've also imposed sanctions on Venezuela. While most of the experts I spoke to think the sanctions will likely starve Maduro of cash and make it hard for him to fund the corrupt patronage system that keeps him in power, Salas and other Latin American experts worry that Venezuelan citizens will most feel the pain because there won't be enough money to pay for food and medicine. Francisco Rodriguez, a prominent Venezuelan economist who has advised the opposition, has written that previous U.S. sanctions made it more difficult for Venezuela to obtain financing and debt relief, which contributed to the ongoing humanitarian crisis. Look, with China and Russia on one side and the U.S. and Latin American countries on the other, it's perhaps too easy to see Venezuela as a pawn in a global power game, especially since there's a lot of coveted oil on the line, and the U.S. in particular has a history of self-interested meddling in Latin America. But the anti-Maduro sentiment that Guaido is channeling is coming from within the country. The rest of South America, worn down by the refugee crisis Maduro sparked, is also advocating for change. In other words, this isn't an internationally manufactured movement. Venezuelans and their neighbors want change. And stepping back for a minute, it's important to realize that there's plenty of blame to go around. In the last few decades of the 20th century, the political elites in Venezuela fell out of favor, and the inequality they fostered paved the way for a populist movement making big promises. That populism was ultimately unsustainable, ineffective, and filled with corruption. This is a dynamic that is becoming increasingly familiar across the world. So, the next few months and few years in Venezuela will be instructive for all of us. But Venezuela isn't just a test case or a political science laboratory for other nations. It's a crisis that affects real people who ought to be empowered to choose their own path going forward.